This move immediately stakes a claim in the center, opening diagonals for the queen and bishop, and prepares for rapid development of pieces. This move, 1, c6, initiates the Caro-Kann defense, a solid and reliable opening aiming to control the d5 square and prepare for pawn advances, offering a robust pawn structure at the cost of initial piece development. This move establishes central pawn presence, aiming to control key squares and open lines for piece development, creating the common Caro-Kann defense structure. This move directly challenges White's central pawn and initiates the highly theoretical Caro-Kann defense, aiming for a solid pawn structure and active piece play. This move initiates the classical variation of the Caro-Kann defense, opening up the position and leading to a pawn structure where White will strive to utilize their central space advantage. This move establishes the classic Caro-Kann pawn structure after White's exchange variation, aiming to equalize the position by developing pieces into active squares and challenging White's central control. This move, developing the bishop to a natural attacking square, prepares to castle and exerts influence on the central squares. Developing the knight to c6 directly contests White's central pawn on d4 and prepares for kingside castling, a standard response in this Caro-Kann variation. This move prepares to develop the queenside knight to its natural square, supporting the central pawn structure and allowing for further queenside expansion. Developing the knight to f6 follows standard opening principles, preparing to castle and challenging White's central control while aiming to develop pieces harmoniously. This move develops the bishop actively, targeting the weak f7 square and preparing for kingside castling while preventing Black from easily developing their own bishop to a strong central square. This move, bg4, develops a piece while pinning the White knight to the queen and challenging White's favorable pawn structure. This move, qb3, pressures the c6 knight and prepares to castle queenside, aiming to exploit the open d-file once Black recaptures on d5. This move prepares to move the queen to a more active square, potentially to c7, to support the kingside advance or to prepare for castling kingside. This move develops the knight towards the center and prepares to castle kingside, while also supporting the c3 pawn and potentially eyeing the d5 square. This move prepares to develop the king's knight and reinforces the pawn structure, aiming to castle kingside and free up the queen. This move, ngf3, develops the kingside knight to a natural square and prepares for kingside castling, while also supporting the e4 pawn. This move, developing the bishop to e7, is a standard defensive maneuver in this Caro-Kann structure, preparing to castle and reinforce the center without blocking the queen's defensive diagonal. This move securely castles the king, bringing it to safety behind a pawn shield and preparing to connect the rooks for future action. Castling kingside is a standard defensive maneuver in this variation of the Caro-Kann, securely placing the king and preparing to connect the rooks for future action. This move repositions the rook to the e-file, preparing to exert pressure on the central pawn structure and potentially exploit the open file if Black's d5 pawn is challenged. This move prepares to reposition the bishop to a more active square, potentially targeting White's queenside or aiming to exchange pieces to relieve Black's slightly cramped position. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, creating potential pressure on Black's queenside and preparing to exchange pieces or support future pawn advances. Exchanging the knight on e5 simplifies the position and removes White's active knight, but it also opens the e-file which White will likely exploit. This move exchanges a minor piece for a potentially troublesome enemy bishop, aiming to weaken black's control over central dark squares and prevent future aggressive play by the bishop. Black's bishop retreats to g6, maintaining its influence on the long diagonal and preparing to contest the e5 square if white's knight returns there. This exchange removes black's active bishop from its diagonal and opens the g-file for white's rook, potentially creating attacking chances. This recapture opens the h-file for your rook and creates a doubled pawn structure for white, which can be a positional weakness to target later. The queen reroutes to d1, preparing to potentially support a central pawn push or redeploy to a more active square on the king side, while also freeing up the e1 rook for potential action. This move initiates a queenside pawn advance, aiming to gain space and potentially create weaknesses on white's kingside or centralize play. This move repositions the rook to prepare for potential operations along the third rank or to support a pawn advance on the kingside, while also freeing the e1 square for further maneuvering. Black's aggressive advance of the a-pawn aims to disrupt white's queenside coordination and gain space on that flank, potentially opening lines for the rook. This move initiates an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to disrupt black's king safety and create attacking chances. This move aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines on the queenside, potentially creating attacking chances against the king. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to open lines for attack against black's castled king. White's aggressive pawn push on g4 aims to open lines for their pieces. But a4 immediately challenges white's queenside pawn structure and aims to create counterplay on that wing. This aggressive pawn push on the kingside aims to open lines against black's castled king, creating attacking chances. This pawn advance creates immediate tension on the queenside, aiming to exploit the open a-file and disrupt white's coordination before developing a more substantial queenside presence. This capture on c4 opens the c-file for white's rook and creates structural weaknesses for black's queenside pawns. Black captures the pawn on b4, a tactical decision to gain material and open lines, though it allows white to challenge black's kingside pawn structure. This pawn push exploits the weakened dark squares on black's kingside, aiming to rip open lines for your pieces and create attacking chances after white's kingside pawn majority. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside pawn chain and potentially challenge white's advanced pawns. This pawn sacrifice opens the h-file, targeting the weakened black king and creating immediate attacking chances. This move, nd7, reroutes the knight to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's advanced pawns on the kingside and potentially support a queenside expansion. This move prepares to support the pawn push on the queenside or to bring the rook into play on the b-file to attack black's queenside pawns. The bishop retreats to a more defensive square on e7, allowing the queen to potentially redeploy and supporting the vulnerable kingside pawn structure. This move aims to activate the rook on the c-file, potentially pressuring the opponent's queenside pawn structure and creating attacking possibilities. This move, qb7, is a proactive repositioning of the queen to connect the rooks and prepare potential counterplay along the b-file and perhaps pressure on white's d4 pawn, aiming to escape the current queenside confinement. This move brings the rook to an aggressive outpost, disrupting black's queen and rook coordination while preparing to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and control the open c-file. The move qb5 aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, threatening the c3 rook and potentially creating counterplay along the b5 g2 diagonal, while also defending the b4 pawn. This move aims to create a safer square for the king and potentially open a path for the c1 bishop to participate in the queenside defense or counterplay. This exchange simplifies black's position, centralizing the knight and aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure, though it allows white to potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. This pawn capture on e5 opens the d-file for your rook and solidifies your central pawn structure, preparing to exploit white's weakened kingside pawn structure. This move brings the queen back into a more active position to support potential pawn breaks and defend against white's queenside pressure, while also preparing to contest the c-file. The king moves to a safer square, creating a potential escape route and preparing to centralize the monarch in the endgame, while also unpinning the f-pawn. This move unblocks the c8 rook, activating it on the open c-file and preparing to contest white's control over this critical central file. This rook maneuver aggressively infiltrates black's queenside, threatening the b7 pawn and preparing to exploit the open c-file for further pressure on black's position. This move aggressively places the queen on a central diagonal, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure and potentially attack the b3 pawn, or prepare for further infiltration into white's position. The rook move to a4 aggressively challenges black's queen and aims to exploit the open a-file, potentially trapping the queen or forcing a favorable exchange for white. This recapture on e5, while regaining material, opens lines and allows white's rook to potentially penetrate black's position more easily. This move activates the knight, preparing to contest the central squares and support potential pawn advances or piece exchanges. Black recaptures the pawn, but white's pieces are now more actively placed, particularly the rooks on the open c-file and the knight on f3 threatening further advances. This pawn push aims to open lines on the kingside and potentially create a passed pawn, forcing black to commit to a defensive structure. Black's queen repositions to b2, offering a potential trade and simultaneously keeping an eye on the c3 square to potentially disrupt white's rook if it moves further up the c-file. This move aims to reinforce the g-file and potentially prepare further attacking operations against black's king, while also creating defensive cover for white's own king. This move aims to activate the king by moving it away from the dangerous open files and potential checks on the kingside, while simultaneously preparing to potentially connect the rooks or offer support to the queen. The rook transfer to the 7th rank aims to activate the rook, create attacking chances along the open file, and potentially pressure the opponent's king or weaken their pawn structure. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, contesting the long diagonal and preparing to defend the c-pawn if it comes under pressure. This sacrifice opens lines towards the black king, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and undeveloped pieces for a swift mating attack. This capture is a critical turning point, accepting a material sacrifice to open lines for white's attack and force a potentially exposed black king.